Lecture: What is Religion? A huge locomotive has rushed on over the line, and a small worm that was creeping upon one of the rails saved its life by crawling out of the path of the locomotive. Yet, this little worm, so insignificant that it can be crushed in a moment, is a living something, while this locomotive, so huge, so immense, is only an engine, a machine. You say the one has life and the other is only dead matter, and all its powers and strength and speed are only those of a dead machine, a mechanical contrivance. Yet the poor little worm, which moved up the rail and which the least touch of the engine could have deprived of its life, is a majestic being compared to that huge locomotive. It is a small part of the infinite, and therefore it is greater than this powerful machine. Why should be that so? How do we know the living from the dead? The machine mechanically performs all the movements its maker made it to perform. Its movements are not those of life. How can we make the distinction between the living and the dead then? In the living there is freedom, there is intelligence. In the dead all is bound and no freedom is possible because there is no intelligence. This freedom that distinguishes us from mere machines is what we all strive for. To be more free is the goal of all our efforts, for only in perfect freedom can there be perfection. This effort to attain freedom underlies all forms of worship, whether we know it or not. If we were to examine the various sorts of worship all over the world, we would see that the rudest of mankind are worshipping ghosts, demons, and the spirits of their forefathers, serpent worship, worship of tribal gods, and worship of the departed ones. Why do they do this? Because they feel that in some unknown way these beings are greater, more powerful than themselves, and limit their freedom. They therefore seek to propitiate these beings in order to prevent them from molesting them, in other words, to get more freedom. They also seek to win favor from these superior beings, to get by gift of the gods what ought to be earned by personal effort. On the whole, this shows that the world is expecting a miracle. This expectation never leaves us, and however we may try, we are all running after the miraculous and extraordinary. What is mind but that ceaseless inquiry into the meaning and mystery of life? We may say that only uncultivated people are going after all these things, but the question still is there. Why should it be so? The Jews were asking for a miracle. The whole world has been asking for the same these thousands of years. There is again the universal dissatisfaction. We make an ideal, but we have rushed only half the way after it when we make a newer one. We struggle hard to attain to some goal and then discover we do not want it. This satisfaction we are having time after time, and what is there in the mind if there is to be only dissatisfaction? What is the meaning of this universal dissatisfaction? It is because freedom is every man's goal. He seeks it ever, his whole life is a struggle after it. The child rebels against law as soon as it is born. Its first utterance is a cry, a protest against the bondage in which it finds itself. This longing for freedom produces the idea of a being who is absolutely free. The concept of God is a fundamental element in the human constitution. In the Vedanta, Sat Chittanand, existence, knowledge, bliss, is the highest concept of God possible to the mind. It is the essence of knowledge and is, by its nature, the essence of bliss. We have been stifling that inner voice long enough, seeking to follow law and quiet the human nature. But there is that human instinct to rebel against nature's laws. We may not understand what the meaning is, but there is that unconscious struggle of the human with the spiritual, of the lower with the higher mind, and the struggle attempts to preserve one's separate life, what we call our individuality. Even hell stands out with this miraculous fact that we are born rebels. and the first fact of life, the inrushing of life itself, against this we rebel and cry out, "No law for us." As long as we obey the laws, we are like machines, and on goes the universe, and we cannot break it. Laws as laws become man's nature. The first inkling of life on its higher level is in seeing the struggle within us to break the bond of nature and to be free. Freedom, oh freedom, freedom, oh freedom is the song of the soul. Bondage, alas, to be bound in nature seems its fate. Why should there be serpent or ghost or demon worship and all these various creeds and forms for having miracles? Why do we say that there is life, there is being in anything? There must be a meaning in all this search, this endeavor to understand life, to explain being. It is not meaningless and vain. It is man's ceaseless endeavor to become free. The knowledge which we now call science has been struggling for thousands of years in its attempt to gain freedom, and people ask for freedom. Yet there is no freedom in nature, it is all law. Still the struggle goes on. Nay, the whole of nature from the very sun to the atoms is under law, and even for man there is no freedom. But we cannot believe it. We have been studying law from the beginning and yet cannot, nay, will not believe that man is under law. The soul cries ever, "Freedom, O freedom." With the conception of God as a perfectly free being, man cannot rest eternally in this bondage. Higher he must go, and unless the struggle were for himself, he would think it too severe. Man says to himself, "I am born slave, I am bound." Nevertheless, there is a being who is not bound by nature, he is free and master of nature. The conception of God, therefore, is as essential and as fundamental a part of mind as is the area of bondage. Both are the outcome of the idea of freedom. There cannot be life even in the plant without the idea of freedom. In the plant or in the worm, life has to rise to the individual concept. It is there unconsciously working. The plant living its life to preserve the variety, principle or form, not nature. The idea of nature controlling every step onward overrules the idea of freedom. Onward goes the idea of the material world, onward moves the idea of freedom. Still the fight goes on. We are hearing about all the quarrels of creeds and sects, yet creeds and sections are just and proper, they must be there. The chain is lengthening and naturally the struggle increases, but there need be no quarrels if we only knew that we are all striving to reach the same goal. The embodiment of freedom, the master of nature, is what we call God. You cannot deny him. No, because you cannot move or live without the idea of freedom. Would you come here if you did not believe you were free? It is possible, quite possible, that the biologist can and will give some explanation of this perpetual effort to be free. Take all that for granted. Still, the idea of freedom is there. It is a fact, as much so as the other fact that you cannot apparently get over, which is the fact of being under nature. Bondage and liberty, light and shadow, good and evil must be there. But the very fact of the bondage shows also this freedom hidden there. If one is a fact, the other is equally a fact. There must be this idea of freedom. While now we cannot see that this idea of bondage in uncultivated man is his struggle for freedom, yet the idea of freedom is there. The bondage of sin and impurity in the uncultivated savage is to his consciousness very small, for his nature is only a little higher than the animals. When he struggles against it is the bondage of physical nature, the lack of physical gratification, but out of this lower consciousness grows and broadens the highest conception of a mental or moral bondage and a longing for spiritual freedom. Here we see the divine dimly shining through the veil of ignorance. The veil is very dense at first and the light may be almost obscured, but it is there, ever pure and undimmed, the radiant fire of freedom and perfection. Man personifies this as the ruler of the universe, the one free being. He does not yet know that the universe is all one, that the difference is only in degree in the concept. The whole of nature is worship of God. Wherever there is life, there is this search for freedom, and that freedom is the same as God. Necessarily, this freedom gives us mastery over all nature and is possible without knowledge. The more we are knowing, the more we are becoming masters of nature. Mastery alone is making us strong, and if there be some being entirely free and master of nature, that being must have a perfect knowledge of nature, must be omnipresent and omniscient. Freedom must go hand in hand with these, and that being alone who has acquired these will be beyond nature. Blessedness, eternal peace arising from perfect freedom is the highest concept of religion, underlying all the ideas of God in Vedanta, absolutely free existence, not bound by anything, no change, no nature, nothing that can produce a change in him. This same freedom is in you and in me, and is the only real freedom. God is still established upon his own majestic, changeless self. You and I try to be one with him, but plant ourselves upon nature, upon the trifles of daily life, on money, on fame, on human love, and all these changing forms in nature which make for bondage. When nature shines, upon what depends the shining? Upon God, and not upon the sun, nor the moon, nor the stars. Wherever anything shines, whether it is the light in the sun or in our own consciousness, it is He. He shining, all shines after Him.